Albert Britt. That's your grandfather.
How about that, Tom? It was really, God, I don't even know how to describe it.
What did you know about him in the military?
We knew very little about my grandfather's military service. So this discovery that you made based on this project, and it's a little bit mind-blowing, but very excited to learn more about Private First Class Albert Britt and his service.
Welcome to Lost Soldiers, a production of Wreaths Across America Radio, brought to you by SaveCedarGrove.org and HistorySouth.org. Here are your hosts, Ché Abdullah and Dr. Tom Hanchett.
Today on The Lost Soldiers, we'll take a closer look at the servicemen who are buried at Cedar Grove Cemetery in Charlotte, North Carolina. We're your hosts, media producer and educator Ché Abdullah.
I'm Tom Hanchett. I am a historian here in Charlotte and very interested in African American history, particularly in the older neighborhoods of this city. It's great to be here. It is great to have the support of the folks at Veterans Bridge Home. We have support in this podcast from the folks at the Imaginon branch of the Public Library and also the Carolina Room of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Public Library.
A big shout out to John O'Connor there for his support in making Lost Soldiers a reality.
Today we're going to explore some of the stories of 20 military veterans that are known to have been buried in the Cedar Grove Cemetery. Most served in World War I, World War II, and together they help us know something of the lives and experiences of ordinary heroes, if you will. Some of the Black history stories that illustrate the African American experience in Charlotte, and you'll hear echoes of what you hear in your own town as well. I'm especially excited to share the story of Wendell French, whose unit served in Wales, Great Britain, where he made friends in the local pubs, exchanging songs and stories with English folks. And also a story that surprised both Ché and myself, the story of Ché's grandfather. We had no idea when we started this research. Ché, not all of our listeners have heard about Cedar Grove Cemetery on the other episodes of this podcast. What is it? Where is it?
Cedar Grove is a place here in Charlotte in a traditionally or historically Black neighborhood called the Beatties Ford Corridor, which holds significant history here in Charlotte. It has a definitive relationship with the old Brooklyn neighborhood that existed for many years prior to urban renewal. When we came across the property at Cedar Grove, I was working, as we've talked about, at University Park Creative Arts School, which is in the heart of Beatties Ford, and separated by a chain link fence from Cedar Grove Cemetery. At the time, I worked at the school for about a year and a half till I recognized that there was even a property there. Just looked like wooded area, and mostly what we saw were nefarious behaviors going and coming. It was definitely a highway for that type of hidden activity, if you will. But what we noticed and what happened one day is I was leaving school. There was a gentleman in the woods with a camera pointed at him. And we've talked about my film background, so of course I was very curious about what was going on. So I approached and found out that Kevin Donaldson, the gentleman being interviewed, was a history student at UNCC. WFAE had come out to learn about...
local NPR station here in Charlotte.
They came out to learn about Cedar Grove, which was really exciting. That article does exist. We'll share that information as the podcast grows. We'll make sure that people can get access to these early stories that happened. But WFAE was the first, really, to jump out and do that story with Kevin Donaldson. So on meeting him that day, we got to work. Like I said, the area was wooded. It was covered. You could not see any of the headstones. A quick anecdotal story I will tell, and I haven't told you this yet either, Tom, but during my days at the school, which could be quite stressful, one of the things I would do with my break was leave. But we couldn't go far because the breaks were short. So I would walk out and I would go and find a quiet space on that wooded path there and just decompress. I remember specifically that one of the first stones I recognized and would see often, I stood near the spot, was Mr. Wendell French.
Wow.
And this is prior to any of our discoveries. So now that has all happened, that's a really poignant moment in my experience at Cedar Grove. Obviously, I have a big passion for it. Everyone knows that knows me and that knows the property knows I'm heavily engaged, and I love Cedar Grove. It's been an incredible experience
We'll
learn more about
talk
it.
in our upcoming podcasts about the ways the community has come together around this lost space, and particularly its lost soldiers. Veterans Day, Memorial Day kind of events, and tremendous interest from the students. And there's even a history club now on that side of town for young people. But let's go back in time to the way the cemetery got started. We're going to have a visit from a community historian who's very knowledgeable about that. But get us grounded here. When did Cedar Grove Cemetery start?
Well, what I love about Cedar Grove, too, is that it's full of mystery. It's changed hands. Its ownership was what I would call non-traditional, as most cemeteries, as we know, are usually attached to a church. In 1914, Cedar Grove came into existence. As you mentioned, J. Michael Moore is going to join us in another episode, and he's done a wonderful history on the area and how the land changed hands, post-emancipation. And that's a really fascinating story. But 1914, the cemetery started with one of the early owners being the Alexander Funeral Home.
Big deal in civil rights, big deal in funeral service, still around today.
And big deal in Charlotte history, obviously. So many things attached to Alexander's over the years, but they do have the distinction of being one of the oldest, if not the oldest, black-owned business here in Charlotte. So at one point they were owners of this cemetery. We know the name changed through some of the ownership hands. It's
sometimes you go back through the newspaper, sometimes it's Cedar Grove, sometimes it's Cedar Hill.
Exactly. So Cedar Grove and Cedar Hill are synonymous with our property on Hildebrand Street. And we are learning more and more as we go through the records that we've been able to locate. I do want to send a shout out to Mr. Kelly Alexander, who is no longer with us recently, but he was instrumental in responding to my request to get information about their attachment to the funeral home, and was able to share some phenomenal information that we'll include in the show as we go forward, Tom.
Wonderful. And then it fell from use in the 70s, maybe, something like that?
That's what we understand. The last documented owner was John Sheed Davidson. He is also buried there and was buried in 1972.
Okay.
As I mentioned, Cedar Grove is such an interesting place because it's full of mystery. One of those mysteries is related to one of our veterans, because in 1986, Bernard Hemphill was interred in Cedar Grove, some 14 years after John Sheed passed and was interred. Another interesting anecdotal fact about just what the land meant in the area and what was happening there over time is when we look at the death certificate of Mr. Bernard Hemphill, he lived across the street from the cemetery.
Oh, wow.
So we don't know if it was a late night sneak attack burial to get him in there somehow, but again, 14 years after we think the cemetery closed or the ownership ended, there was an additional burial. Fascinating stuff.
So let's dig in here and talk about researching these 20 veterans. Who's buried out there? How did you start working towards that list of everyday heroes?
That's a great question, Tom. And really where we are with that and how that really got underway was through this partnership with Veterans Bridge Home. We mention them often because they are a pivotal part of what we've been able to achieve on that property and also what we've been able to learn. So with the military folks that we started to identify and clean up their situation, try to find more information about them, and also try to locate additional soldiers, we've done the research through, like I mentioned, the contact with the Alexander Funeral Home. We talked about John O'Connor and the Carolina Spangler Room. Did I say it right? Spangler, Carolina?
Robinson Spangler, Carolina Room of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. Thank you, John.
Okie dokie. Thank you very much for that, Tom. But John's been really key in helping us find a lot of great research. I actually had multiple chances to go over and look through the Alexander Funeral Home, basically collection that they have at the Spangler Room.
Wow.
Obituaries.
Ooh, I got to get into that.
Yeah, we will definitely get in there together, Tom. But we were able to locate some obituaries, some death certificates, even prior to digitization. So we've located death certificates from Cedar Grove burials that are handwritten One of the key research tools, again, provided by the Alexander Funeral Home, was access to their burial records, literally were turned into basically receipts of the burials that they've done there. So it's interesting to see the prices as they've changed over the years. And one of the other things that really stood out to me in looking at, well, two things stood out to me really plainly in looking at the death certificates, even related to our soldiers, that the addresses were all from the old Brooklyn community that we talked about. So the attachment and the time span that's been covered by that cemetery here in Charlotte is really a phenomenal look and snapshot at history and how things have evolved to where we are today, Tom.
And where Ché Abdullah got me involved as a PhD historian interested in Charlotte history, I've done work with 2 neighborhoods along that Beatties Ford Road corridor, helping them do the research to become official historic districts in Charlotte, the McCrory Heights neighborhood and the Oaklawn Park neighborhood. But when Ché gave me the spreadsheet, he copied down names, some basic military data, birth and death dates, and the first thing I did was go to vintage newspapers. And if you are considering any kind of research, know about this. The Carolina Room of the Public Library has them accessible for free through a unit called Newsbank. And also, if you are an Ancestry subscriber, there's a even larger database called newspapers.com. And it is just remarkable. It's new in the last 10 years or so. You can word search every newspaper in the United States, just about, not quite, but almost, from now all the way back to the beginning. And anything you're interested in, people with odd names like Wendell French, we love that because it makes it easy to word search. But that tracking of individual stories, that's the thing we're going to talk about in the rest of the podcast today.
And you mentioned earlier when we were chatting off, Mike, about the Charlotte History Toolkit. I'd love to know more about that because hopefully what we're going to have happen with our Lost Soldiers podcast is people are going to realize that the great stories to tell and that there's an easy avenue to find some of this information.
Yeah, write down charlottehistorytoolkit.com. Even if you're not from Charlotte, write that down. And what it is a website that a number of us who use this material regularly put together that kind of introduces you how to do some of the basics of neighborhood history research. And how do you find newspapers? How do you find subdivision records for your neighborhood? How do you find city directories that tell you what to do, what folks did for a living back in the day? And so charlottehistorytoolkit.com will get you places, or you can go directly to the vintage newspaper databases, newspapers.com or Newsbank, which here in Charlotte is available through the Carolina Room of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. So that's all of the footnotes. What do we find? Well, as I'm looking at the research spreadsheet, the first thing I find is that there's a lot we don't know. Even with this newspaper research that I'm going to lay out for you, we really didn't have it for everybody. For 6 of our 20 men, and they were all men, we only know basic military data. They served in either the World War I era or the World War II era. Maybe we know that they were a private or something like that. And you know, for 6 of the 20, that's all we know. One name. Well, we're going to throw out some names here. Maybe you're related to these people. Let us know. We would love that. But the odds are pretty long. For instance, Richard Adams was a private in the U.S. Army. That's about all we know. William Bradford was a private in the U.S. Army. Common names, tough to trace. Sometimes the military info was a bit more specific.
For instance, Harrison Davis.
Yeah.
Private, he was in the U.S. Army serving in World War I with the Company A422 Reserve Labor Battalion Quartermaster Company.
All righty.
So
now, I'm not a military history expert, so somebody out there may know how to get to the records of the Reserve Labor Battalion Quartermaster Company. in World War I, but I can tell you what a quartermaster did. And this is the kind of work that African American history makers were often kind of plugged into in the military, was doing the same kind of lift and carry kind of work that they often did at home. We have truck drivers, we have folks who know how to unload ships, we know folks who know how to transfer goods onto a flatbed truck without it falling off. And the quartermaster company was where all that stuff worked. Where all that stuff happened was quartermaster depots. There was one in Charlotte. We'll talk about it in another episode. The quartermaster was the person who had the warehouse with all the stuff that needed to go to the military. Tents, I would imagine, Jeep parts, shoes, all of those things have to come to a warehouse and then have to go out where they're needed. And someone like Harrison Davis, World War I, Reserve Labor Battalion Quartermaster Company, did that. Another couple of folks that we know names of, William Taylor, who was assigned to a chemical battalion in World War I. Don't know what that was about. Look forward to finding out. Adam Davis, technician 4th grade in an engineers battalion during World War II.
That's amazing, Tom. It looks like from World War I to World War II, our soldiers had a little bit of growth in the engagement and activity they were able to get involved in. So it's really neat to see the progression there. I really love the fact that back to 1914 is when our cemetery started. We believe through some of our anecdotal conversations that the Spanish-American War is represented there as well. We're pretty sure about Vietnam and probably some of the conflicts in between as we find more and more. So just like we talked about with the research, an amateur historian or even a person interested in this type of thing with no background, it's been really eye-opening to try to learn the process of finding out who these folks are and where the information is about them. I really appreciate how we've come up with this title, Lost Soldiers, because essentially what we're finding out is that a lot of this information is indeed lost and may be lost with some of these soldiers that we come across as we try to contact family members, find out more about them and their service, and celebrate them and their role in America's freedom, but also in what we have to celebrate and enjoy here in Charlotte today.
So we only have basic tombstone data for 6 of our 20 men. You can get a beginning of a story, as we've just seen. But we do have minimal newspaper coverage, at least minimal, for the majority of them, for 14 of the 20. Again, as we mention names, please let us know if you know any of those folks. But the fact that there were newspaper write-ups in, frankly, the white-controlled media of African Americans, it surprised me a little bit. And what I've come to realize is that back in the day, newspapers, they covered much more than they do now. And they welcomed folks from the community making submissions. The Rotary Club sent in their minutes, not only the white Rotary Club, but also the black Rotary Club, for instance. Funeral homes loved sending in obituaries. They would send in a basic death notice when someone passed away, and then maybe they would follow it up with a slightly more extensive obituary. None of our guys had really extensive obituaries, but it's pretty impressive that you can turn up some cool stories.
I think that's really interesting that you mentioned that, Tom. When we talk about, again, lost soldiers and the stories that we're celebrating here and acknowledging these soldiers and learning about their service, etc., that in the newspapers, even if we are able to locate them, the focus is to ignore a lot of these stories intentionally, and they didn't really either make it or we didn't get really a full gamut of the contributions, actually the number of soldiers that were involved in all of our military conflicts and supporting our military since the very beginning. So really excited again with Lost Soldiers that we'll get to talk to people like J. Michael Moore, who'll give us a great background on the history of Charlotte's engagement, military engagement, and then we can look at how the black soldiers were introduced into that. What was happening in life and times of Charlotte as these things happened and as conflict broke out beyond our shores, and how that affected the communities here.
Yeah, what we're doing basically is the kind of detective work that historians do when you get beyond the rich and the famous. And we treasure the facts that turn up. I'm going to pick an obituary here, and we're going to read through it. This one is all of 4 paragraphs long, and one of those is visitation at the Alexander Funeral Home. But Ché, read a sentence at a time for the obituary of Frank Floyd Brown.
And it looks like, Tom, we're pulling this from the Charlotte Observer.
Yep.
And is this date correct here?
1986.
So this is an obituary from 1986, and we're talking about Mr. Frank Floyd Brown, who was 91 years old at the time of his passing. Residence listed as 2025 St. Paul Street, and he died February 6, 1986 at Veterans Administration Medical Center in Salisbury.
Hang on there, and let's dig into what we know so far. We've got the guy's name. We know that he lived a good long life. And in an era when African-American life expectancy, well, still in our era today, is not as long as it is for white males in particular. That's an impressive thing. He lived on St. Paul Street, and if you know the Beatties Ford Road corridor, on one side is where the Cedar Grove Cemetery is, the other side are the Gospel Streets. And the Gospel Streets, St. Mark, St. Luke, St. Paul, I don't have all of them. And that's where some important people have lived in this community do today. Thelma Byers-Bailey, who's on school board, lives there. Sarah Stevenson.
Wow.
Sarah Stevenson, first African-American woman on school board.
Wow. What I love about this show, Tom, is just the remarkable things that we're going to come across. I didn't know any of that. And all the time I've spent in the Beatties Ford corridor, the hard work that I've done there, and the people I've come to know and love over there, I had no idea that was the way the street configuration was made. Fascinating.
So, Veterans Administration died at the Veterans Medical Center in Salisbury. If you are a veteran, you probably know that in this region, until very recently, you had to go to Salisbury for your medical care. And so we're getting a story about this guy.
Yeah. Again, I love this, Tom. So his funeral was at 2 p.m. on a Sunday at United House of Prayer for All People, another very influential
The Mother House. United House of Prayer for All People is a denomination that's now nationwide, but it got part of its start in Charlotte in the 1920s. And he would have been a kid, a young man, when that denomination started with a big revival here. African-American evangelist Charles Manuel Grace, they called him Daddy Grace.
Daddy Grace.
Today the denomination is headquartered in Washington, D.C., but still very active in Charlotte, United House of Prayer for All People.
Well, very prominent here as well, too. We know there's one on Beatties Ford. We know there's one up in the Pottstown community up in northern Mecklenburg. So, he was a part of a pretty influential sect here in Charlotte.
And the Mother House is the big one on Beatties Ford Road, one of the largest religious buildings in Charlotte. So, wow, cool.
Yeah.
Let's see. Burial will be in Cedar Grove Cemetery. There you go. Alexander Funeral Home is in charge. We've talked about Kelly Alexander and that important family.
Absolutely. Mr. Brown also worked as a Coca-Cola bottling company retiree. He was a member and Grace Soldier at Mother House of Prayer.
And Grace Soldier is one of it's not quite deacon, but it's in that kind of thing there as well. So he had a pretty middle-class kind of job out in the world, working for Coca-Cola bottling.
Yeah, absolutely. And survivors of Mr. Frank Floyd Brown were his wife, Geraldine, a son, Ulysses Ford, and a daughter, Miss Josephine Allison. A visitation happened from 7 to 8 that evening at the Alexander Funeral Home. We would love to see if we can find out more about Ulysses, Miss Josephine Allison, and Geraldine. So if there is an opportunity, reach out to us if you know something about these folks. But that is what we've learned about Mr. Frank Floyd Brown from the Charlotte Observer in 1986. I think, Tom, if we look at something else, something earlier, we'll probably see a difference in the amount of information shared.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing. Then I've got one here for Harrison Davis, and this is from 1962. Harrison Davis, 74, died yesterday. It gives his address, mentions his funeral at Temple Chapel Baptist Church and the name of the pastor. He will be interred at Cedar Hill Cemetery. There were no survivors.
How about that, Tom? That's what we're talking about, right? Cedar Hill Cemetery, Cedar Grove we've talked about, but it has those two names, Cedar Grove or Cedar Hill Cemetery, as we do the research and as our listeners come forward with information or do research on their own families, we can pull all these things together and get these stories told. So that's a fascinating how there's just a few sentences mentioned about Mr. Davis.
Which is very different from Wendell French. This was a big surprise. I'm going to tell you our journey at the end here when we discovered Wendell French and his military service and his pal Albert Britt, who is...
Yeah, Albert Britt, my grandfather.
Alrighty.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me start out with the death notice in the Charlotte Observer in 1968. It is all of one sentence. Wendell French, at a particular address on Beatty's Ford Road, died Friday at his home. That's all it says.
It doesn't even say Wendell. It says W.
Yeah.
Period. French.
And wow, so nothing. I had no hopes for this one.
Here's a great anecdote too, Tom, that I don't think I've shared with you real quick. Is I looked at that address, so I've found Wendell's home and I've seen it.
Oh, cool.
His
Still there?
home. Yes, it is. It is now a masjid, a mosque.
Cool. Wonderful. Beatty's Ford Road, very interesting place. So as I'm doing the newspaper research, and what we're going to talk about today is pretty much just newspaper research and then a real quick general Google. But I found a story from 1941, beginning of World War II. Draft quotas now 60% filled. Mecklenburg boards talk about who they're going to be drafting, and then there's a list of who's been selected. Mecklenburg's 5 draft boards have sent 69% of the year's quota of men to camp so far under this new draft law that they had in World War II. And one of the folks is Wendell W. French. So there he is in the military, 1941. And another article that shows up is about his brother. It's the brother's obituary. Victor Clay French, Jr., passes in New York Hospital. And this is from 1947. And it mentions 5 brothers and 2 sisters. That's fascinating. Including Wendell French of the U.S. Army. So I have a better sense of the different kinds of career paths that folks had. 2 of the sisters, both the sisters actually, one of the sisters ended up in Washington, D.C., the other in Charlotte. And so we're beginning to fill out his family story there. And one of his brothers is Sergeant John V. French, and there's a whole story about him. During World War II, the military had publicity people that let folks know on the home front that their loved ones were doing good work, and sometimes they would feed material into newspapers. And the Charlotte Observer printed this in 1944. Charlatan is commended. Sergeant John V. French playing big part in race for mechanical supremacy with U.S. supply forces in France is the dateline. World War II has developed into a race for mechanical supremacy, and his men such as Sergeant John V. French, Charlotte, North Carolina, who are helping the Allies keep abreast of the Germans in this field. Sergeant French, who is now serving in the 13th Engineer General Service Regiment, is a mechanic in the unit's motor pool. His job is to see that motorized equipment is kept in shape. His regiment is doing general construction behind the front lines. It talks in the end here about other brothers who are involved, other family members who are involved. One's an electric welder with the Norfolk Labor Yard, and there's Wendell French, also serving overseas.
That was amazing, Tom. We didn't plan this, but I'm really fascinated by this this obituary that you've been able to pull up from 1947, and I want to read that. So Victor Clay French Jr. passes in a New York hospital. Victor Clay French Jr., eldest son of Mr. and Mrs. Victor Clay French Sr., who are very influential people all of a sudden with the what their kids went on to do.
Yeah.
So acknowledging them, I love to see that, and I would love to learn more about what they did and what their experience was to lead up to getting these men in the military. So this is a military family we're finding out here as well for Wendell, which is amazing. So his father left for New York yesterday. Let me go back because I skipped some stuff. Mr. and Mrs. Victor Clay French Sr. of 200 North Myers died yesterday in a New York hospital. His father left for New York yesterday. Funeral arrangements were incomplete last night. Surviving besides his parents are 5 brothers: Wendell French of the U.S. Army, John Thaddeus, Edison, and Tommy French of Charlotte, 2 sisters, Miss Carol Wooden of Washington, D.C., and Miss L. Morris Kendricks of Charlotte. Again, we'd love to find out more about the family, and if you are out there and listening to our podcast, please reach out. We'd love to talk to you and learn more.
But wait, there's more. The newspaper search, again, these are little short things, but dang, they put together a story. I wondered if Wendell French showed up in any newspapers outside Charlotte. It's as easy to do that with newspapers.com as it is to search your own town. And bingo! A story from the Fort Sill Army Base out in Oklahoma in a local newspaper out there. And it's not a real happy story. Man accused of drunk driving. Wendell W. French, 29, Fort Sill, Negro soldier. That's the way they identified folks back in the day. Is in county jail today, waiting an appearance before the county judge on a drunk driving charge. Oh dear. Let's follow that. And we found an earlier notice, again in this same vein, a car accident in 1936 involving our friend, Mr. Wendell French, and a friend of his. They were both in a car, ended up in a wreck late at night, and the friend was a white guy who was a bootlegger. Been previously picked up with a cargo of 60 gallons of whiskey. So this is, Mr. French is somebody who may have alcohol issues. You can't tell for sure, but he certainly is someone who is part of that world where the authorities keep trying to clamp down on alcohol consumption, alcohol sales, and folks find a way around. So it's a little bit of a story. Yeah. But then I did something I should have probably done earlier. I could have, which is just a basic Google search for this guy with this blessedly distinctive name. Love distinctive names. Wendell W. French, and bingo. What we found was his memoir of being stationed in the United Kingdom, in Wales, and discovering pubs.
Wendell, bootleggers, pubs, all fits together. And it's no surprise to me that my grandfather was a part of this unit.
Read a little bit of Wendell here.
So this is written by Wendell.
Part of a yearbook for the 643rd Port Company, Transportation Corps. Basically, they loaded and unloaded ships. That was their work in World War I. But they would have times when there weren't any ships to unload, so they'll go off and be allowed to explore the countryside.
And here's some of the writings from that time in the 643rd Port Company memoirs. Pub crawling with Wendell W. The Finger French. the company's foremost authority on Welsh customs and traditions, and especially on drinks alcoholic of any nationality. Should like to take the liberty and pleasure of dedicating this tale of the Welsh pubs to Mr. Ted Gillard, proprietor and operator of the Three Blackbirds Inn in Monmouthshire, South Wales. He's a personal friend to almost every member of the organization. There are few of us who have not enjoyed the hospitality of his hearth. Those of us who stopped by to wet our whistles were destined to return again and again to the Cotswold cottage-like structure nestled by the side of Blackbird's Lane. We learned early during our stay in Wales that the pubs are as much a part of the landscape as the pyramids are to Egypt. They have been a national institution for many years, and no one doubts that, like swing music, they are here to stay, Tom.
Now, swing music is a big thing in African American culture in the late 30s, early 40s. It's giving this new musical style to the world, and they're personally hand delivering it there to Wales.
Well, you know what I also find neat in this, Tom, is they mentioned Cotswold cottage-like structures, and we have a Cotswold area of Charlotte.
Named after the one in England.
So I did, those are lessons learned here for me as well. Let's continue. The pub is as indispensable to the Welsh as is tea to all Britishers, and as our double feature movies are to us.
A little bit more pop culture there.
How about that? We discovered that a pub was more than a bar. It is, to be exact, a somewhat homogeneous combination of a bar, town hall, women's knitting and gossiping circle, game room, public meeting place, farmer's grange, and what have you, all in one. So it sounds like that was the center of town. This is where things were happening at the pubs in Wales, and our guys from the 643rd Port Company jumped right in, Tom.
Wendell says the pubs were the first spot we looked at on our first passes. We wanted to quench our thirst. There was a little difficult getting accustomed to the lukewarm beer. It was a little difficult ascertaining the value of the British pounds, crowns, shillings, and pence, rather than struggle and try and fathom it. We just thrust our hands filled with the stuff and asked the pub keeper to be honest. Wow, it is something to be halfway around the world and discover all of this new stuff. A typical night of the week. Pick up, Ché.
I did have a quick question, though.
Yeah.
I wanted to sort of register. We haven't talked much about how old these guys were. This is my grandfather when he was 20, 21 years old, probably.
Wow.
If even. I'm not even sure, but I'm going to look into that. So let's look at a typical night of the week. Any night could be called the typical night, according to Mr. French. There's Sergeant Willie Sloan playing a medley of tunes on the piano. Sergeant James Stevens would be leading the pub crawlers in We'll Always Be Together. Private First Class Albert Britt would be sipping suds and have two arms around as many smiling, chirping lasses. PFC Thomas James Towns, PFC Monroe W. Clark, and Corporal Jimmy Sanders would all be eyeing the same spot.
I'm going to pick it up for a minute, and then we want to come back to Albert Britt. Welsh love to sing, says Mr. Wendell W. French. They're somewhat partial to the Old English ballads and Irish folk songs. In our way, we converted them partially to our downbeats and boogie. Before long, they were giving out hit parade numbers and other popular tunes of the day, and of course the traditional ballads were up our alley, as well as the folk songs, so we joined in with them. What a picture of getting out of the hard work of unloading ships and finding some cultural exchange in the countryside of Wales. Albert Britt, that's your grandfather.
How about that, Tom? It was really, Scott, I don't even know how to describe it. Moving,
what did you know about him in the military?
Moving, chilling, all that type of stuff to figure it out. But we knew very little about my grandfather's military service. He had 5 kids. I've inquired with all of them multiple times about his service, and none of them knew very much about it. So this discovery that you made based on this project and the early engagement that I made with the cemetery, not knowing that this type of relationship was even fathomable, one of the first things you come across is references my grandfather and his service. So, I mean, it's a little bit mind-blowing, but very excited to learn more about Private First Class Albert Britt and his service prior to being a family man. I think this is before his kids.
Came from Winston-Salem, so the two kids would have known each other, the two Carolina buddies in the 643rd Port Company. A little description in the yearbook that we found online: a very smooth dancer and all-around sportsman, was caught up in one of the top booby traps on the channel. Believed is leaving his souvenirs across the pond.
And what does that mean? I'm going to have to look more into that. Souvenirs across the pond. Well, funny enough that they describe my grandpa this way, because when I do speak to my family about him, although we didn't know much about his military experience, they remember how sharp a dresser my grandpa was and what a smooth talker he was.
Someone who liked the ladies and vice versa.
Vice versa. And he did great with his wife Betty, my grandma, and mother to all 5 of his kids. So he scored after a lot of practice, it seems like, in getting Miss Betty to turn her last name to Britt and bringing my family about, and ultimately myself. So, I mean, what a remarkable full circle, the engagement and sort of, I don't want to call it a discovery, but my stumbling into the world that is Cedar Grove and what we're finding out about it. Tom, this is amazing, and I'm looking forward to talking more about the 643rd Port Company, old Albert Britt here, reading some more great stuff by Mr. Wendell French. Take a pause there and say not only was he a soldier and a decent bootlegger, looks like he only got caught once, he was also a great writer. So what a talented man, what a brave man, I would say, about Wendell French to do quite a few pioneering things. He seemed like he wasn't afraid to just get right out there.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Lost Soldiers, produced in partnership with Wreaths Across America. And if you want to support Cedar Grove Cemetery?
Yeah, there are several ways that we'd love to engage you. SaveCedarGrove.org is our website. You can visit us there at wreathsacrossamerica.org. If you type in NC0582P in the search bar, you'll come across Westside History Club sponsorship group for the Cedar Grove Cemetery and our Wreaths Across America wreath-laying ceremony. We really thank you for listening. Look forward to sharing so much more about the lost soldiers of Cedar Grove and the times and places that they traveled and the places they came from. I am Ché Abdullah with Tom Hanchett, Charlotte's most handsome historian, and we thank you for your time.
Thanks for listening to Lost Soldiers, a production of Wreaths Across America Radio, brought to you by SaveCedarGrove.org and HistorySouth.org.